PCM TV is supported by Salient Systems, a world leader in video management security, and by Revolutionary Clinics, a medical dispensary where the patient comes first, and by Accounting Buds, your number one CPA specialist for the cannabis industry.
Well, I tell you what, it's Friday afternoon, and I'm ready to thank God I made it through another week. I'm Jimmy Young from Pro Cannabis Media. Who else is here?
David Rabinovitz, his trusty sidekick, and our special guest,
Mr. Morgan Fox from the NCIA out of Washington, D.C. Hi, Morgan. How are you?
I'm doing great. It's been a wild week. Thanks again for having me.
No, and by the way, they must have known that every third Friday you come on our show to talk about the goings on in Washington, D.C., and you've had quite a bit. First of all, let's start with the Safe Banking Act and where we stand right now, because that was one of the big stories coming out of Washington, D.C. this week, that we are looking at revisiting that bill that was already passed, not once, not twice, but three times by the U.S. House of Representatives, correct?
That's absolutely right. In September 2019, the Safe Banking Act became the first standalone cannabis policy reform legislation to ever make it to the House floor for a vote, and it passed with overwhelming bipartisan support. I think the exact vote count was 321 to 103, with nearly half of sitting Republicans voting in favor of it. And then, unfortunately, the pandemic delayed consideration of it as a standalone bill in the Senate. But over the last year, the House has included identical language to that bill in two separate COVID relief bills that they approved. Unfortunately, it didn't make it into the final versions of those bills, but it's really indicative of the support and momentum that this legislation has. Incremental though it may be, it's absolutely necessary to start moving in the right direction in terms of federal cannabis policy reform. Especially when we look at issues like public safety, transparency, and access to capital, particularly for smaller businesses and marginalized communities that don't necessarily have access to angel investors and deep financial networks.
You know, if I remember correctly, Michael Correa, who's one of your lead lobbyists down there in Washington, D.C., he called it low-hanging fruit, that the Safe Banking Act may be the first win that you guys can go after as a positive. Are you getting feelings that there are some Republicans that may actually switch to the other side in the Senate and actually support this?
Well, to be completely honest, if Mitch McConnell would have brought the Safe Banking Act for a vote in the Senate in 2019 or very early 2020, pretty confident it would have passed. This bill has broad bipartisan support. It's pretty clearly a narrowly tailored public safety and fairness bill. It's only incremental. It doesn't fix all the problems with cannabis prohibition, but it's a step in the right direction. And it's a sort of thing that Republicans who aren't quite on board yet with comprehensive descheduling legislation can really sink their teeth into, particularly with regards to helping small businesses and protecting public safety. So, we see a clear path forward for this legislation in both chambers, and we expect Senate introduction or reintroduction very soon.
Does the Go ahead, David. I know you have something to ask, and I think it's the same thing I was going to ask. Go ahead.
No, probably not. But Morgan, off the top of your head, do you know how many people are employed directly in the cannabis sector at present in the U.S. and total employment when you consider feeder industries that support cannabis?
Well, the latter part is difficult to tell, but Leafly just came out with the latest iteration of their jobs report that showed that 321,000 people have full-time employment within the cannabis industry in the United States right now. And that is a significant number, particularly at a time when unemployment is rampant and when people absolutely need jobs and when states need the tax revenue generated by these industries. And the lack of access to banking doesn't just affect businesses; it affects employees too. We've heard from multiple businesses that say that just because their employees work at a cannabis business, they can't even get personal bank accounts, and that impacts their ability to get housing loans or even be able to get leases for apartments, to be able to buy cars, things like that. If you can't have a bank account because every bank that you're working with is going to drop you as soon as they find out that you're involved in cannabis. What kind of a quality of life can you really have? It creates tremendous barriers for basically every single person involved in the cannabis industry, whether that's employees, employers, tax collectors, people that are providing services to cannabis businesses, utility companies. It's an across the board affront to the idea of legitimate, transparent business and being able to have oversight over this multi-billion-dollar industry.
If I remember correctly in that article, now there's more employees in the cannabis industry than there are electrical engineers in the United States of America, and that fact alone kind of surprised me, but not anymore. Let me go back to the Safe Banking Act just for a quick. Does that provide the 280E will disappear, or is 280E still going to be a sticking point with the industry if the Safe Banking Act does come to the floor?
Not at all. The Safe Banking Act has no impact on 280E. What would have an impact on 280E would be comprehensive descheduling legislation. Right now, there's not really that much appetite in Congress for addressing 280E as standalone legislation or as a narrowly tailored issue. But if we deschedule cannabis through either whatever legislation the Senate is about to introduce, or like through things like the MORE Act, that would automatically take care of the 280E issue. And I think it's more timely now than ever, as the IRS is actually starting to take notice of the cannabis industry a lot more and is really looking more into their federal tax filings. However, at the same time, they also provided guidance to cannabis businesses on how to properly file their taxes to make sure that they weren't making any mistakes that could be used to ding them later. But the fact remains that they can't deduct business expenses. So, regardless of whether or not they have guidance on how to be overtaxed to the point of business failure is kind of irrelevant.
Well, what isn't irrelevant is what's going on in the White House with some of their employees right now. And for those that aren't aware of this story, it seems some younger people who are now employed at the White House have been asked to resign because of past cannabis use. And going into this election, the Democrats made it very clear that they were friendly to the cannabis consumer. And would, in fact, other past administrations have actually said it's okay if you had past cannabis usage in your record, and they were looking for transparency. But now that is not the case. And you woke up to that this morning, Morgan. Can you walk me through how this all kind of unfolded?
Well, I mean, I'd like to start with just an anecdote that might be apocryphal, but it's one that I've heard repeated several times from people that I reliably trust, that when the United States was sending military groups to Afghanistan immediately following 9/11, that the CIA did not have a single speaker of Pashto or Urdu, the native languages of Afghanistan, because every single one of the applicants had been disqualified for cannabis use up to that point, at least in recent history. So just indicative of how much this hiring prohibition on past cannabis use has impacted our ability to really have the best people involved in federal government jobs. Fast forward to today, we're seeing that the Biden administration has made a lot of purported statements about the fact that they support fairness and sensible cannabis policies, but apparently that stigma about past cannabis use still exists. And, quite frankly, it's completely ridiculous considering that 3 of the last 5 presidents, including the current president's last boss, were admitted past cannabis users. And these are people with the absolute highest security clearances and the absolute highest responsibilities of office in the nation. So the idea that past cannabis use would disqualify somebody or make somebody unfit for service in either the White House or for a security clearance is just ridiculous.
Yeah, but
certainly,
remember,
go ahead, David.
DUIs are okay and domestic violence is okay. It's just that really dangerous thing, that marijuana, those crazy people, they can't be in the White House.
Absolutely. And, we're looking at recent studies that show that cannabis consumption, or at least responsible cannabis consumption, is not tied to workplace injury or decreases in productivity. But alcohol absolutely is. So it really makes me wonder, is the Biden administration going to be asking questions about past alcohol use with regard to employment?
Aaron Smith, the co-founder and executive director of the NCIA, I'm going to read the quote that you shared earlier today. While we may not know all the details of these cases, this looks really bad for the White House, said Aaron Smith. Punishing current and potential employees for past cannabis use, particularly under circumstances where it was protected by state laws, flies in the face of the administration's purported emphasis on fairness and sensible cannabis policies, to say nothing of its very recent guidance to federal agencies in this area. At the very least, this sends the wrong message to federal personnel managers, as well as policymakers and employers across the country. How big a deal can this be? And it doesn't sound like there were that many, but even if there was one or two, it's still a story. And the Daily Beast, I believe, is the one that actually broke this. But, what's going to happen next, Morgan?
I mean, I think it's really difficult to tell. We saw the White House press secretary, Jen Psaki, trying to downplay the actual impact of this. And as I said, we don't know all the details. Maybe there were other extenuating circumstances beyond simple cannabis use. But at least from what the Daily Beast reported, it seems as if a lot of these employees were led to believe that this wouldn't be an issue when in fact it was an issue. So, I mean, just it makes me wonder about what kind of a place the White House is going to be to work if that's the sort of information that they're giving to the younger employees. But, I think it's also important to note that, these people were being honest. They were, they knew that that this could be an issue, and they were told that it wasn't going to be an issue, and then it became an issue. Not only that, but like most of these are younger people who, for a significant portion of their lives, regulated cannabis systems have been a thing. They've been a reality, and particularly in the district. Cannabis has been legal for possession and cultivation in DC since 2014. So it's really tough to say, but I would caution against using this as sort of a rubric or like an indicator that the Biden administration is now all of a sudden anti-cannabis. These orders and these personnel decisions don't necessarily come from the president. The fact that they're making these decisions in terms of staffing doesn't necessarily equate to opposition to sensible cannabis policy reform coming from Congress. And Congress was always going to be the driver on this. It always has been, and I think it always will be. Does this mean that the Biden administration is going to oppose comprehensive or even incremental cannabis policy reforms coming from Congress? I don't think so. But I think that it's pretty tone deaf when you look at everything that's going on politically and culturally in this country, not just around cannabis particularly, but around criminal justice reform and the lingering effects of being involved in the criminal justice system, or not even that, of being involved in activity that may or may not be legal in a given state, but is still technically legal federal or illegal federally.
Right. And, it's funny, it's not funny. The Emerson College poll of about a month ago talked about how the most important issue to adults, 61% that were polled, and I think they had something like a couple of thousand people, adults polled, that cannabis legalization or the cannabis reform policy was very important to a majority of Americans. They'd like to see something happen, and they like to see it happen sooner rather than later. And I don't know if this little incident with some young employees at the White House might help or hurt this cause. It certainly, again, brings it back to the forefront, to discussion points, doesn't it?
Well, I mean, I've been on the phone with reporters all day long, so I think that it definitely is noteworthy. When you really think about it, though, at least in my experience, politically, support for cannabis policy reform is very broad, but not very deep. And when you look at it in terms of priorities, it is usually way down on the list for both lawmakers and voters. So I would be very interested in taking a look at that poll, because that seems to run counter to everything that I've seen in my experience. But that doesn't mean that I'm not wrong.
No, and then, Emerson College, which, by the way, employed me earlier in 2020. Not that I'm biased or anything. It's a very reputable school in the Boston area for communications. So I'm actually not surprised that it actually got the kind of attention that it did. And I'll be happy to share. It was about a couple of months ago, but I'll be happy to share those results with you if you want. David, you got something? It looks like you got something.
Yep. So that was February 9th, Jim.
Thank you very much.
61% of U.S. adults say marijuana, yes.
Well, saying yes, but that doesn't mean that it's a top priority issue. I mean,
No, but that was the question: is what is the number one priority past COVID? So they said, let's take COVID out. In February, they said that was more than immigration, more than the minimum wage. They said this issue was important to them. More than those others. So in that regard, I thought it was an interesting poll because in comparison, and right now, by the way, between what went on in Texas with the weather, with the immigration issues on the borders right now, and COVID and the vaccination rolling out, I mean, look, I'm not that naive to know this is still a major, there's a lot of problems going on. I'm glad I'm not the president to have to prioritize what I should be focusing on or not. However, that being said, I don't think this issue goes away anytime soon, Morgan. And I hope that the work that you guys do in the trenches there will finally pay off, because there are a lot of people who are waiting to see what's going to happen.
Well, I mean, part of my job and the job of our government relations team on the Hill is to make sure that this issue doesn't go away, and it absolutely isn't. I would like to take a look at that poll, because that would be a very interesting trend reversal from what I've seen in the past. And I'm sorry that I happen to have missed it. As you said, things have been very busy over the last couple of months, both
Yes.
inside and outside cannabis policy.
Yeah.
But I think that the fact that this issue is being championed by Senate leadership means that we are going to see some progress. Hopefully we'll see some incremental measures passed, and maybe we have an opportunity to actually get comprehensive descheduling measures passed in this Congress as well. It's more likely that that'll be pushed a little bit further down the road, at least as long as the filibuster is still in play. But regardless, this is a topic of conversation that is at the forefront of the conversation around criminal justice reform and around economic recovery from the pandemic as well.
Right. Chuck Schumer, I'm pretty sure, said something this week about he's certainly aware that I think he called it big marijuana, is out there, and he is aware of that and is trying whatever he can do to make sure that they don't take over the direction that cannabis reform might go. How do you manage that when there's a lot of money still being played in that space, whether it's alcohol, getting involved with infused beverages, or just straight descheduling? But I was actually pleased to hear that some Senate leadership like Chuck Schumer actually said, we're aware of it. We're going to try and protect the little guy if possible.
Well, I think that that's been the focus of the legislative efforts from Majority Leader Schumer, as well as from Cory Booker and Ron Wyden and the rest of the supporters that they have in the Senate, to make sure that the industry becomes one that is fair and equitable. And I believe he was particularly referencing big tobacco and big alcohol companies, not necessarily big cannabis companies, although those lines are starting to blur more and more as we go along. To tell you the truth, I've always sort of envisioned cannabis or the cannabis market to look very much like the beer market as we move along, where there are, a handful of really big companies that control a fairly large market share, but there's also a very robust craft industry with thousands of producers and retailers around the country that also have a very, very big market share. And I think that as long as we approach this legislation recognizing that there are going to be big and small and medium-sized players, and make sure that they all have equal access and equal opportunities to enter the space, then we're probably going to be all right. But it's going to take a lot of diligence. It's going to take a lot of vigilance. And it's going to take people like Chuck Schumer recognizing that it would be so easy for well-funded existing industries to come in and take over the cannabis industry, and that we absolutely have to protect the ability of legacy operators and small businesses to be able to enter the market effectively. So, I mean, it makes me feel good to hear those things.
Yeah, and that's why I remembered it. Makes me feel good too, Morgan. And it makes me good whenever I talk to you on the third Friday of every month on our Green Rush Live show, because we really do get a feel for what your job is all about and how challenging it is to kind of navigate through the Washington, D.C. Politicians and all that game out there. So first of all, thank you as always for coming on. And as we check the clock, it's 4:20, which is the time when we take our first break. I explained how 420 was started by some high school kids out in the Waldos, they were called, back in 1971 at San Rafael, California High School. And they used to meet at the Louis Pasteur statue across the street after school to catch a little buzz. And that year certainly does coincide with the year that I too first tasted cannabis. And there was a song that I related to. It did nothing to do with 420. It had to do with the words of the song and the folk rocker, Jonathan Edwards, who penned it. It's called Shanty. So we take a break. We thank Morgan, and we'll be back on the other side with our cannabis marketing discussion. And we've got an all-star lineup, so don't go away.